Journey on the Fly family, thank you for joining me for another podcast. So I'm trying to wrap up the steelhead fishing beginners podcast class, we'll call it, all right? This concise way of kind of putting some steelheading thoughts and excitement into people's heads, because lo and behold, I've kind of gotten behind on things, and with that, now we're coming pretty close to the end of the season. I know this information will be good for next season, but nevertheless, I feel a little crunch on time. So remember, we are a full-service guide service. Boy, there's some redundancy, huh? Remember to find us where all good podcasts are found, from Spotify, iHeart, iTunes, and even on our website, which is journeyonthefly.fish. And if you have any questions or comments that you'd like to direct towards me, feel free to send me an email. And you can send me an email at journeyontheflygs@gmail.com, or you can reach me through the website if you like to. So let's get at and talk about some steelhead fishing flies, right? All right, friends, it is the month of February by the time that you'll be hearing this. And we've had some wild weather. I am grateful for the amount of rain that we got. We did see a little bit of freeze, which locked up some of the creeks and lakes around us. We got a little bit of ice fishing for those guys and gals that love to go out and ice fish. I don't know if we're going to see any of that cold weather poke back in, because February is only 28 days. And generally speaking, we start to see a bit of a warm-up in that month. So that also means we're going to start seeing the Pennsylvania run steelhead start to move their way back into the lake here in the next month or so. It really depends on the fish in particular, and I can't give you a date or a time that all happens. It varies from season to season and climate to climate. But there's one thing that's consistent: steelhead eat flies. And there's also another thing very consistent. If you're going to go after steelhead with a fly rod, you're going to need some flies, right? So today I want to take some time, not a lot of your time, to talk about my recommendations for some flies and then some nuances that I think are helpful. I think, and the nuances I want to give you today are really to push your creative abilities and your tying abilities. But we'll get to that in just a couple minutes. So let me start with kind of setting up this picture, which we already did on I think it was our first episode we did, which is, the critter that is the steelhead. They are in a sense, they are migratory, where they spawn up into the tributaries in which they were originally planted, and then back out into the lake once the spawning has all taken place and water temperatures begin to rise or go nil in those tributaries, and other factors that may be there when that all kind of kicks in for the migration to head back out into the lake. Now, in the same terms where you have Pacific Northwest and steelhead in other areas like Argentina and stuff, you will, in Idaho, you'll see some of these steelhead that will, well, maybe not Idaho, but in the Pacific Northwest in particular, where you have what we would call true steelhead that migrate in and out spawning-wise of the ocean, which is pretty cool. But there's some interesting things that I'm pretty sure I brought this up before, but it really bears bringing up and witnessing again, and that is there was a study done on the kind of steelhead when they're in the lake and their dietary habits. And if I can find it, I will link to it if I haven't done it already, but not either way, I'll try to get it linked in there. And it's not a really particular detailed study in that there's not all kinds of intricacies and measurements. But one of the things that's interesting that they did, they tested about 8 or 7 areas on the lake throughout the year, catching assorted amounts of steelhead. I'm sure there was some kind of a control amount that they had caught, like maybe 100 or something each time, each place. But the point is they took these fish, they pumped their stomachs and they basically sorted through the content to find out what a steelhead's diet is throughout the seasons or throughout the year. So here's the interesting one. So in Pennsylvania, we typically start to see somewhere between September and October the run of steelhead, at least the staging of steelhead at the tributaries' mouths. And during those dates, this study found that the number one, I'm calling it the number one, the highest percentage of consumption or food in the belly of a steelhead were rainbow smolt. Now, to me, as a fly fisherman, I find that fascinating information because it tells me something that I can kind of, granted, I am speculating here because, like I always say, who's actually talked to a trout? But we have enough data, I think the speculation bears some credibility. So here's my reasoning. If 70%, which is what the data showed, of a steelhead's diet in September is rainbow smolt, then as they approach the tributaries and even run the tributaries for most of their time, if not all of it, instinctively, the learned behavior, eating pattern, if you will, of these fish is some kind of smolt or bait fish, in particular, rainbow smolt critter, right? That's their food. That's what they're kind of distinctively ingrained in their little brains and their habits to see and consume. 70% of their diet when they're in the lake. So what does that translate to the fly fisherman? That means I better at least early season, if not the whole season through, and I advocate the whole season through, to be honest, but in specifically early season, you better have some streamer patterns in there for sure. And you better, if you're going to fish the mouths, you better have streamer patterns. Not because they may or may not run better in the current that's there at the mouth, but because there aren't any eggs floating in the water like they would be floating in a current seam or stream in the tributaries themselves. So for me personally, and what I'm going to try to do here is sum this up into like 4 or 5 or half a dozen flies that you should have in your box in different sizes and in different weights. Those are really important, 2 important nuances or 2 important key elements to having a good fly box for any fish, in my opinion. So my number one fly in my box and the number one producing fly for myself and clients this year was my little, I call it a dirty rainbow smolt. I call it dirty because it's easy to tie, and there should be an accompanying video to this. I've shot the video. I just need to get it quickly edited and get it onto the YouTube channel, which, by the way, goes by the same name, Journey on the Fly. So find us there. Plus, oh, by the way, we also now have all of these episodes on YouTube under the podcast area. So there's another place that we can be found. And hopefully, if you don't have availability to these other apps, you at least have the YouTube. Find us, listen to us. Appreciate it. Okay, done with that commercial. So my dirty rainbow smolt is really simple to tie. Plus, it looks butt ugly when it's not wet. There's where it really gets its dirty name from. It just doesn't look like a great tie until it's wet. And it's, arguably I'm not a good tire. I don't have that finesse. Whatever the case is, it looks really good when it counts, which is when it's wet. We have hooked in the mouth, have had that fly taken, broken off, bent for fighting, whatever the case is, more times than any other fly in my box. Now, we've learned to tie it with various materials. We've learned to tie it with various shades and colorations, sizes. And when I say size, we do a lot of tight lining. And even when I am indicator fishing with clients that don't want to tight line, then we're still using weighted flies because it eliminates a whole lot of things, which I'm not going to get into, except to say that I don't dislike split shot. But adding split shot changes the drift. If I can put my weight primarily in the fly and adjust it according to flies in my box, then I don't have to add or have split shot on me 99% of the time. So that's all I'm going to say about that. So have a streamer pattern. You have things like the White Death. That's why that fly is so incredibly popular. Imagine tying that fly with weight built in it. Then you don't have to add any split shot to it. Couple different sizes, 2-3 different weight sizes. That way, different currents, different levels of water, you can still fish and get those critters down. Not to mention, an unweighted fly can do you some good if those fish are hanging up further in the column, because it'll still sink some. It just won't sink as fast. Just a thought. Different technique, different approach, something that may work when something else isn't working. So one of the things we have to also understand about most of the tributaries, and I've flipped whatever rocks that are available through most of those tributaries, is that there just isn't a lot of bug life. And the main reason is that the Bethnic layer, that subsurface layer, if you will, where most of those critters inhabit in a regular trout stream, it doesn't exist in Lake Erie. Conneaut has a little bit of it. Some of the lower ends of the creeks have them. But most of that water, the substrate is shale and it's slick, and there's nothing for those critters to grab onto. Now, with that said, I've flipped rocks and I've actually found some bugs, but not in an abundance enough to say, oh, I need, this particular size and this particular color. I think some really good patterns to have still goes back to the lake life of these fish. And that is, they see hexagenal limbatas, they see caddis flies, they see stone flies. Those flies do exist in those lakes. Not in the quantities eaten year long. There's the key, year long in the lake by these, because the hatch and things and the movement of those is what really drives, I think, the eating habits of nymphs and mayflies and things like that for steelhead out in the lake. But nevertheless, there's still a percentage of that fish's customary diet having seen those. And I'm going to go as far to say this. I think there is a built-in instinct in these fish that while they're in the water and they're consuming in the way they do, which is a whole nother discussion, that when it resembles food and it comes into their mouth and you have an opportunity to set that hook within a millisecond or less, most things will work throughout the season if it's drifted properly. That's more important in fly section and always will be, but I will never, ever, and if I have in the past, forgive me for making this terrible mistake, but I will never diminish the importance of fly selection in a lot of streams. And I'm not going to get into it too depth, but I'd like to do a little talk on my first official Team USA fly fishing competition, which I got my butt handed to me by a bunch of teenagers, which was awesome. I know that sounds crazy, but I wasn't there to necessarily win. I forgot a fly box that I should have had. I could give you 30 other excuses from being old and half blind, which I'm not half blind or really that old. But I am so excited to know we have anglers, men and women, male and female, coming up in the ranks that truly care about the fisheries, truly look at the science and the intricacies and the tactics that are there and apply it. And they did really well in a freezing cold winter day, even in a spring creek. But the point is that 99.9% of the fish in that stream were not caught on what I was fishing. They were caught on eggs, what everybody else was fishing. So fly selection really does matter, but drift matters more. So, and we've talked a little bit about that drifting. So let's move on to the next fly, as I'm kind of segueing or hinting at, which are nymphs. Those are critters that live and exist in the lake life, and the eating habitats of those fish, which I just mentioned. So what kind of nymphs should you have? Well, I think you should have a variety of colors and not be surprised about what those fish will and won't take. At the end of the day, they are rainbow trout for the most part. At least they seem to act in many ways like rainbows. They look a lot like rainbows. And being that they're not a pure strain of steelhead, well, we'll just leave that where it is. So These fish are going to eat different variety of colors and a different variety of sizes. Now, I typically and personally, even for steelhead, do not fish anything larger than a 14 or a 12 when it comes to a nymph. That's not to say I don't have them in my box. It's more of a comfort or a confidence type of thing. So we have caught fish on size, let's see, what's the largest? I think I may have had an 8 or 10 on for a client this year. And that was a Hexagena lambada nymph imitation that we used there. It was what they call a Michigan wiggler, which is something to check out. Not too many videos added on there. I kind of did my own little variation of it. And then we've caught fish on something as small as a size 20 or 22 midge, drifted under an indicator in a really slow pool. So actually, that was a dry dropper day, and I remember catching that fish in particular because it was like that was I had to catch a fish doing that particular style and with that small of an insect. But the small insect, and here's where fly section becomes important. The reason the variation in sizes is important is because that was a crystal clear, a gin clear water day, and we were practically laying in the water, casting quite a ways upstream to keep our distance and our stealth from those fish, and they just weren't responding to anything larger, which goes back to saying something else about midges. Midges survive, and you can go check out our winter fishing podcast to hear a little bit more about this, but the most prevalent insect in all of the waters all over the country, I think, are probably midges. And they are definitely in the tributaries. You will see some hatches occasionally on those. It's about the only thing you'll see a relatively, quote, consistent seasonal hatch on. And don't be afraid to use them. So midges would be my second, we'll say, subset of nymphs, right? That'll be our first. That'll be our first nymph I talk about, right? Let's talk. The midge is an important one to have in your palette of flies. I think you should have it in, I don't know, half a dozen or a dozen colors. However, whatever you want to do to your box, however you want to trick it out. Now, be careful, because here's what I will say. You don't want to open your box in a panic and not know what to put on. If you're going to make a lot of different looking flies, just be willing to have a good time and experiment. But if you want to be able to walk out and fish proficiently and fish in a way that doesn't cause, I'll use my friend Josh Miller's terms in his new book, eliminate variables. So if you have 13 different varieties of nymphs, of midges in particular, there's nothing wrong with that. There's no, you shouldn't do that as a fly fisherman. But if you have a couple of those you're confident in, leave the rest behind unless you're going to just experiment. That way, when you pull what you want to out of that box, when you open it up, you look at it, and you pull that fly and you tie it on, you know you've caught fish on it before. You know you have confidence in it. And you get to play around and experiment whether those fish will take it drifted well or not. So that's my take on kind of fly selection as a whole, as you put in the box for your steelhead stuff. I have one box that I use for steelhead, and it has all the flies that I will use throughout that season because we're not going to make it complicated. So my next, in the subset of nymphs, my next is going to be just kind of your waltz worm variations. Have them in 3 or 4 different colors and 3 or 4 different weights. I wouldn't go too crazy with the steelhead. I don't think you need to be that particular in dropping weights and sinking rates, because there's different water types, but you can control the drift and the depth a lot if you have 3 or 4 different weighted flies of the same species of flies, if you will. So take a waltz worm, for instance. I have, I don't know, 3 or 4 colors of waltzes, and I may put a hot spot on them or something like that. But I'll have each one of those. Like my particular fishing box for trout has 5 different weights on each variety or color of one. Let's say I have a light olive waltz. I will tie that 5 different weights. One size, 5 different weights. And I don't really have a lot of different sizes. Now that's that's trout fishing in general for wild fish, but in particular the steelhead. I think if you had a handful of waltzes tied in 3 to 4 different weights, let's say you do something small as an 18, you do a 16, and then maybe you just bump up to a 12. Skip over the 14. I don't know. That's up to you. And tie 3 or 4 different weights into that bug. Now, always keep in mind that the hook weighs itself too. And the less material you use, the quicker the fly will sink. The more material you use, the more buoyant the fly is. Just a little hint out there if you're going to tie flies or buy them for that matter. It's something to look at when you're buying flies that a lot of people don't think about. So here's a nuance I'll throw into you on a little rabbit trail that I mentioned earlier on. So if you want to really, in my opinion, up your game when it comes to the crowded amount of fishing, like this year, man, we had a bottleneck like for a month and a half at the mouths of these tributaries because the water just wasn't there for the majority of fish to push up. So you would go in there and you would literally be standing side by side for most of the decent fishing geography that was available for us in those days. So those fish, in particular, those fish that were kind of stuck in those spots, they saw a lot of flies and lures. There is a way that we kind of think about this, right or wrong. You could test it out. I think we have tested it out a little bit. What would make your fly, we'll say, stand out or be taken when the guy upstream has already hooked the same fish, or that those fish have seen it and they may have come back down to move back up? Well, maybe it's how you tie it. So one of the things I really want to encourage you about and push your creative side is you'll hear people say, well, they changed the dubbing. It's still the same fly and they call it such and such. That's so stupid. Listen, man, I'll be honest. Those people are stupid. You tie those flies any way you want them. Just do it good and call it whatever you want. You allow your creative juices to roll. Don't listen to dum-dums like that. Most of those people barely fish, or they've got such a high idea or image of themselves in their own mind that it's not even worth the conversation or even listening to a bit that they have to say. So be creative. And here's an instance. So I have this fly, I call it the steel waltz. And I call it that because, well, I fish that because I made it specifically for steelhead. And the funny part of it is it kind of resembles steelhead colors. It's actually kind of funny. Now, it's a particular dubbing, which I have a video coming up for that too. Excuse me. It's particular dubbing. It's something you got to get from the UK or mix your own, whatever. And I've caught steelhead on it this year. The first steelhead I caught this year, I caught in a size 18. I think it was a 2.5 millimeter bead under an indicator because I was fishing an eddy and trying to get those things into that from a distance that I just couldn't do tight lining. I needed kind of advantage that an indicator brings, even though I was disadvantaged in the response of a hook set or take rather, a bite. And it's a simple fly. It's a dark or either a matte black bead, or you can also use a glossy nickel black bead. And it has a black wire ribbing, and it's a trout line dubbing with a blue accent collar from some blue thread. And I call it my steel waltz because I built the fly for steelhead fishing. And I have it in a dark, and I have it in a light, and I have it in about 3 different sizes, actually it's the same fly, 3 different bead weights. I actually may have 4. Sometimes I make a really heavy bead if I want to get down in the current where some of those crazy fish are locked under. The current seems really fast, but then there's a pocket of slow water underneath there, and I'm trying to reach that really quickly. Or at some of those plunge pools, which are very difficult to fish and actually hook a fish in the mouth, for that matter. So some kind of variety of waltzes, and then, man, don't forget your pheasant tail. Some kind of mayfly nymphs that have a tail to it and some some variegation or some gills on the side of it. You don't need to be super particular, but if you want to, there's nothing wrong with that either. You're going to lose a lot of these flies, more so to snagged fish, fish breaking off, and to shell snags. So the reason I say don't make them too complicated isn't because I'm trying to suppress your creative ability. It's to be realistic that I would rather you tie 30 flies in a couple hours than tie 15 or 10 and then find yourself losing a bunch. So it just seems to make more practical sense that way. So we've got our smolt or our bait fish. We've got our, and those you could vary in size too. To be honest, the trick for me this year has been size 14. I tie those critters in a size 14 and the fish take it. They just do. Now I'll bead size up and down to give myself a little bit of depth control and so on when it comes to sinking rates and so forth. But you don't need to tie them real big. You don't need a size 10. The fish take them, sure, but I found that they take that 14 more than any of my larger sizes. I just have. Because that's closer to the average and it doesn't spook them if it looks unreal at all. So we've got our midges that are consistent. They're there. You can tie them and you can just be a wild man when it comes to those. And those are good crossover flies. Pull them out of your trout box and bring them with you or whatever. Those are great crossover flies for all trout. And then your different varieties of your waltzes, different colors and sizes, right? Or more so different weights. And then some mayfly juice, right? You want that in there. You want that because they see that hexagena lombata, that wiggler. Man, that's a fly that those fish see. They see that big old crazy hex nymph. We get a fantastic hatch up there. You can read stories about it from the Erie Times and so forth. And it hits the news quite occasionally. And so you got to have something with some wiggle to it, right? So a Pat's Rubber Legs or Miller has a beach body stone. That fly, I think, gets overlooked because that beach body stone has a fantastic sink rate. And I also think that you can tie it in a couple different colors. It's not a hard tie. I think it's like 3 materials, not including hook bead and thread. Then but you can put some movement into it. You can put some variegated silly legs and things like that on it, or just use some floss for the legs. But you can do some things with that, and you could tie that in a bigger pattern. You could tie that in you could tie it in a 14 if you want, but a 12, a 10, an 8, things like that. And those are fun because, right, you can feel that baby. You can see it plop into the water and all that kind of fun stuff. Now, here's my take on fly sizes. This is in as far as color variation. I have found, in my opinion, in my little fishing career, is that bigger flies work great in more colored water, faster currents, and when it comes to darkened water, I am a fan of chartreuse and flashy colors. I just am. Will those fish on occasion take them into clear colors? Yeah, but it's a lot more. I think it's decreased a lot more than when the water's up or colored or so forth. So that's why I like those bigger flies to have them. Or if I'm in a situation where I got a big pole that is darker on the bottom, but it's got a good current in it, I'll throw those big flies on there too, because I can usually give myself quite a bit of distance. It's usually the angler that scares the fish, whether it's by his very presence or his drift, his or her presence or drift, than it is the fly itself. So here's what I'll end on. I know everybody's jonesing because you're like, why hasn't he said about eggs yet? I'm getting there. Hold on. Keep your panties on. So eggs are fantastic. Some people fish them year round. I've heard Jeff Blood talk a few times, which I'm supposed to have him on here sometime soon. It's in show season and he's out and about. He fishes 2 flies almost all the time. He fishes a streamer and an egg all season long. And does he catch fish? Yep. Now, I usually fish eggs a little later in the season. When those fish start to really do their thing, and they start pumping eggs out, then the other fish have seen eggs enough consistently that they'll probably take it. Now, will they take it beginning of the season? Sure they will. Ask me why. I'm going to tell you I have no clue. It's just drifted properly. And they took it, and you set the hook right. That's all I can say. And good for those fly fishers that pull that off, because I'm just going to give them credit. They're probably drifting it well and getting it to the fish, and the fish are taken and they're setting the hook properly. But eggs are important on a particular portion of the season, like I mentioned. When the females have broke apart their eggs, they've found a place to, quote, spawn, and they've made a red of sorts or whatever, or they're just dropping eggs because it happens to be, they're just coming out. They can't hold it. I mean, who's not caught a fish and had eggs dropping out of them? Usually when you start to see that as consistently as you can see it, that's when I will put eggs on more often. Will I experiment through a day with eggs? Yes, I will. Having eggs, again, in a couple different weights. Sometimes you want that egg to just sink real nice and softly. Maybe you got it attached to a 2-fly system, and the other fly is there to drag the egg down, because eggs have a tendency to kind of roll across the bottom and bounce up into the current and bounce, and them back down into the bottom. But they kind of roll along the bottom more than anything. And then depending on current, of course, and substrate. But tie yourself a variety of colors. Give yourself a goal of like 4 to 6 different colors. Tie those eggs in 3 different weights. That's a big key, because what you see invariably is one egg, one size, and that's it. Maybe in a couple different colors. And when I say eggs, I'm talking about sucker spawn and things like that too. I personally don't fish sucker spawn. It's an idiosyncrasy of mine. This is the first year I've really allowed myself to experiment with more flashy things, and that's why I've just been reluctant to do so. Some people have a massive amount of confidence in things that have flash. I don't. I'm working into that, and I'm having great results, and I'm becoming more confident in it. So thank all of you for having done it and encouraged me to get those in the box as well. So that's kind of it. That's my general approach to the introduction to steelhead fishing when it comes to fly selection. Now, here's what I want from you. Whether you are find this on YouTube, get in the comment section, or send me an email, because I would love to hear what you're using. Whether you agree with me or disagree with me, and why, right? In any kind of argument, please don't just disagree with somebody and say because. It's not even a reason. It's barely the beginning of a bad sentence. So I like to keep things as simple as possible. I've been working at that for the last 5 years, just really trying to say, okay, I don't need 13 different fly boxes. I don't need literally 30 different types of flies in my box. Find what works for you in confidence. Tie them in a variety of weights and some variations to them, and run with that, because I think you'll have more success, because here's what will happen. You'll be able to concentrate on the really important things, which are the people that you're with, the beautiful environment that you're in, the memories that you're making, and in particular, fly fishing, controlling your drifts properly, making accurate casts, and controlling your drifts properly. So that's it. I didn't keep you too awful long. I know this might have anticlimactic for some of you folks that know what you're doing. Maybe you learned some things this time. But get out there, get your lines wet, keep your flies in those fish's mouth. Till the next time, remember, it isn't about the destination. It's the journey that makes you. God bless.